McCosker. And in 1939, Frank was a 17-year-old pineapple farmer when he heard the drums of war beating in Europe, after Hitler invaded Poland and Britain declared war on Germany. Frank answered the call for King and Country. He hitched a ride on the milk truck to Caboolture to enlist in the 9th Battalion, our battalion. But upon arriving at the enlistment station, he was told that he was too young to enlist. So he walked back out the door, changed his date of birth on his enlistment papers, and lined up again. And from there, Frank trained part-time in the Army Reserve while still working on the farm. So now, rolling forward 3 years after his enlistment, it's now 1941. Frank had already reached the rank of sergeant, which is practically unheard of. It normally takes a digger about 10 years to get to the rank of sergeant. Your man did it in 3. And by December 1941, World War II was raging across Europe, and most of the Australians were fighting the Italians under Mussolini, and then the Germans, commanded by Rommel. And in that chaos, as it rained across Europe and Africa, the Japanese decided the time was right for them to enter the World War II in epic proportion. And on that dark December night in 1941, the Japanese Air Force practically destroyed the entire US Navy moored at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And from there, the Japanese war machine turned south and started its rapid advance down through the South Pacific, smashing its way through parts of China, taking over the Philippines, occupying the Dutch East Indies, which is now Indonesia, taking Malaya, Timor, and finally defeating the British in Singapore. And at this time in history, the Japanese war machine had never been defeated on land, and it was fast heading for Australia. And the situation, as I said, was even more dire because most of our fighting age men were over in Africa. Hence, the defence of Australia was thrust upon largely inexperienced Army reservists like your own Frank McCosker to stop the threat of the Japanese invasion of Australia. And Frank told me when he first set sail for World War II, he was on board a stock-carrying ship still strewn with sheep shit across the deck when they set sail for a place called Milne Bay on the far east of Papua New Guinea. And from a military viewpoint, Milne Bay was considered as key terrain. It had to be held at all costs as the Japanese were rolling ever closer to Australia, across the Kokoda Track and down through the Solomon Islands. And by this time, Frank was now the platoon sergeant, which is essentially, he was second in command of 30 men. And Frank described to me as he arrived at Milne Bay, there was a frantic effort to construct 3 airstrips for the Kitty Hawks from the 75th and 76th Royal Australian Air Force squadrons in an effort to keep the Japanese away from the bay. But as usual, most things in the army, things change at the drop of a hat, and Frank's platoon commander was pulled out, so he was promoted in the field to acting platoon commander at the ripe old age of 20. And within days of landing, Frank was informed that about 2,500 Japanese Marines had landed about 5 miles up the beach. And he was informed that the Japanese had captured and tortured soldiers from the 61st Battalion. And then he watched soldiers from the 2nd 10th move out in front of him to take the fight to the Japanese. Little did those soldiers know that the Japanese were armed with tanks. And so upon contact, the 2nd 10th took serious casualties and had to withdraw back down to the beach. And Frank told me something that you'll never read in a history book. He described watching soldiers, Australian soldiers in 1s and 2s, running back toward him. Some of them didn't have a weapon, some of them had even lost their shirts off their back. They'd been completely dominated by the Japanese. And when I heard this, I pictured what it must have been like. It's 1942. You're a 20-year-old pineapple farmer from Caboolture and a part-time Army reservist. The enemy you're about to encounter had never been defeated on land. In fact, it had already destroyed the US Navy at Pearl Harbor. They've taken over most of the South Pacific, largely unopposed, Singapore has fallen, the war in Kokoda isn't going so well, and the Japanese had already started bombing Darwin behind them in preparation for their invasion. And you and a couple of mates are about the only thing standing in their way. And now with your own ears, you can hear the battle raging in front of you, and you're told of soldiers being massacred just ahead of you, and now you're watching your own mates come running back toward you. And I asked him, how did you feel at that point, mate? And his response was, Tom, it was a pretty bloody demoralising sight, but I had accepted the promotion, so I had to put a brave face on for the sake of my own men. And by this time, there was 3 battalions lined up on an airstrip, with a few more battalions in depth in amongst the coconut plantation. And the next thing that Frank told me that you'll never read in a history book was exactly 3 a.m. on the 31st of August 1942. He was awoken from his sleep by the loud sound of a Japanese gong ringing out in the coconut plantations. And then a Japanese officer yelled out in perfect English from the other side of the airstrip, "We are coming across now." And Frank recalls hearing this and then heard a young Aussie digger down the line yell, "Like bloody hell you are," and all hell broke loose. And Frank described to me in the darkness as those 2 mighty armies clashed under a hail of gunfire, and he was seeing Japanese tracer bullets flying at him. So that's 1 in every 5 is tipped with a chemical that lights up when it's fired through the barrel of a rifle. And he said, Tom, with the amount of Japanese tracer flying at me that night, I could have read a bloody newspaper under the ambient light. We hooked in there all night, and by the morning we were covered in our own shell casings. And as the sun rose, I looked out to see the airstrip covered in dead enemy soldiers, and I realised we had finally stopped them. And the news of that defeat of the Japanese at Milne Bay sent a morale-boosting shockwave across the Allied world, which was recorded in the words of a British Field Marshal, Sir William Slim, who stated, "Some of us may forget that of all the Allies, it was the Australians at Milne Bay that first broke the invincibility of the Japanese army." Ladies and gentlemen, the spirit of the Aussie digger may have been born in faraway battlefields across Europe and Africa, but it was created in little towns all across Australia like your own. I thank you for making the effort to come out here to remember them and to pay tribute to their courage and sacrifice. For one who sees no past is blinded by the future. And I think any soldier who paid the supreme sacrifice would never want us to see another bloody war, lest we forget.
Lest we forget. Yeah, lest we forget.